Thank you very much. I appreciate these talks. They've really set the stage. The one thing I don't appreciate, though, and I have a bone to pick with the organizers, is why did you put the attractive people on first? People with hair and people can see well, all those kind of things. Doesn't make sense. Makes it harder for me to look good. So I'm going to talk. Thank you very much, Isaac. Isaac's one of my best supporters. And when you have a boss that's one of your best supporters, that's pretty great. So thank you very much. So I'm going to talk with you today about human frailty, but not just about the parts of our lives that are difficult and the limitations we have, but about how the virtues are designed to help us to flourish. Let's see. Ooh, I can do it. So let me start at the beginning, which there are two now obvious ideas. They didn't used to be obvious. This is part of what Sonia referred to, is that in recent years, we've come to see that human flourishing is possible, that this is something that we can do, we can focus on, we can get better at, and it's a very good goal in life, or at least something that we want to try to bring about. And so I've been studying human flourishing for a long time, and I'm using the word flourishing. Some people say happiness, some people say well-being. Let me tell you why I like flourishing. Flourishing tells us that we can live fully, we can live richly, we can grow and develop. We can, if you think about a flourishing plant or a flourishing organization or a flourishing person, I think it gives you an immediate image of someone who's doing extremely well in many, many ways. And so I like that a little better, because we can get confused with the idea of happiness and think that it's just an emotion. It's a way that we feel. And certainly happiness is great. I would never be against happiness. But I think there's more to it than emotion, so that's what I try to capture with flourishing. So I've been studying this for a long time, and some of you have partners, and you know what your partners do? They, in a very loving way, they ask really hard questions. So my wife one day said, well, Blaine, you study flourishing, and that's really great and everything, but don't you notice how hard life is and how much we suffer and how many difficulties we have and how limited we are? How can people flourish like that? And I said, well, let me think about that for about 5 years, and I'll get back to you. That's what academics do, especially Aristotelians. So I did think about it, and what I came up with is that we do have frailties indeed, so there has to be a way to link those two things. There has to be a way that as the limited, imperfect creatures we are, we can still live really well as human beings. And so that's what I'm going to talk with you about. So then there's an ancient idea that I brought into this. This is the one from Aristotle, and this will be all the philosophy I'll give you, just about. So don't be too scared about that. Is that what he said is flourishing is nothing more than living our ordinary lives in excellent ways. So there's no magic or something esoteric or secret about it. It's just simply a matter of living excellently, doing all the things that we ordinarily do, but doing them with excellence. And I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means. And then we put together, I should acknowledge that I've worked with two of my good friends on this. We put together Frank Richardson and Brent Slife, and I'll show you a slide with their name on it in a minute, two novel concepts. And that is that when we started to think about this problem, what we realized is that when you look at Aristotle's list of virtues, or any list of virtues, you start to see that they're actually tailored to the specific weaknesses and limitations that human beings have. Really interesting thing to think about. And that, in fact, that's what Aristotle said a virtue is doing something with excellence. And so our human frailties are actually a pathway to flourishing. We usually think of them as a limitation, as an obstacle, something we have to work around. But what we came up with is it's actually the way that we get toward flourishing. So I'm going to give you a simple example of that. We're frail creatures. We're vulnerable to being harmed psychologically, socially, physically. And when you think you're going to be harmed, when there's some threat, it's perfectly natural to feel afraid, to have fear. And fear is a very good emotion to have. So it may be that the building looks like it's going to collapse, or there's a tiger on the loose. Well, it's really a good idea to be afraid of those things, because that motivates us to do something about it. So it's a very sensible response. But if we live with fear all the time, then that constrains us. It keeps us from taking risks, keeps us from doing things, trying to achieve things, trying to hope for things. Fear can be a real dampener. So we don't want to be afraid all the time. So that's why courage is so important. Courage is the virtue that helps us to deal with fear in the right way. So it helps us If we're courageous, we understand when it's important to stand and fight for something, when social justice matters in a way that we should struggle against the odds, or if a friend of ours is being teased in a way that's really hurtful, that we stand up for that friend. So that's what courage is for. It helps us to act well in risky situations. So when something important is at stake, then it's important for us to take risks, to defend or protect or further that important thing. So we need courage to be able to pursue a good life, because it's not always easy. We have to take risks. We have to go up against the odds sometimes. We have to try and become better. Personal growth is risky. It's difficult. It requires courage. So that's what we need to have. So this simple example then gives us something to work with, so that we don't have to just be subject to fear. So appropriate risk-taking is essential to flourishing. We can't have a good life if we're not able to take risks. So that links that frailty with flourishing. So how does that work? Well, our humanity entails frailty. We're dependent beings. We live very complex lives that are hard to sort out. We have limitations. I don't know about you, but I confront those limitations every day. If nothing else, it's simply I don't have time to do everything I want to. And so we have limits of energy and time and money and so forth. We suffer as human beings. And that's one of the things that I have a little bit of trouble with positive psychology. So when Sonia was talking about it, she talked about negative psychology as the history, and then along comes positive psychology as an antidote. But what I want to do, I don't really like dividing things that way. I want to bring it all together in one whole. She would probably agree with me if she were here, and Martin Seligman would probably agree with me. But here's what happened. They didn't do it. They didn't do it that way. They don't talk about it. So if you read the books, you don't find discussions of suffering. You don't find discussions of limitations. What you find is that we should overcome all these things. Well, this is really hard to do as a human being. We can't just eliminate suffering or complexity. We can't even eliminate evil, the things that people do to each other that are so destructive. So we have to find a way to deal with that and still have a good life. So that's, I think, a big question. So how, this is my wife's question, coming back to it. How is it possible to flourish as frail creatures? Okay? That's a hard one. So we think that the contemporary theories have not helped us very much. So we decided to put together something that would provide a little bit more help with this linkage between imperfection, weakness, and the good life. So there are a few exceptions. So there are a couple of my favorite philosophers, Alistair MacIntyre and Martha Nussbaum, have written books about this, and a friend of mine, Ron Miller, wrote a book about suffering. And then my favorite authors over there on your right wrote a book called Frailty, Suffering, and Vice. So we put this book together as a way to describe this linkage. And as long as I'm shamefully self-promoting, I have flyers for the book, which is coming out in about a month. So if you're interested in this topic, that's an easy way to connect up with it. So I'm just going to spend my remaining time mostly talking about dependency. Both speakers prior to this have mentioned how social we are. I would say that we could be called an ultra-social species. We're extraordinarily social. We can't live without connection, is what we've been told. And to flourish, we need connections. But guess what? When you have connections, when people really matter to you, they matter because you're dependent on them, and they depend on you. So dependency is something that's can't be eliminated, at least not and have a good life, but we tend to minimize it in our society. In my field of psychology, it gets minimized and pathologized. We have a diagnosis of dependent personality disorder, right? That you can be too dependent. Well, yes, you can be dependent in bad ways, that's true. But you know what we don't have? We don't have a diagnosis for independent personality. We don't have a diagnosis for that. So that's a way that you see that. So we tend to minimize it, and I think the reason is that we don't like really facing the vulnerability we have as dependent beings. So if I'm depending on someone, I'm vulnerable to their emotions, to their capacities, to their needs, and vice versa. So this is a vulnerable position we're in. I can be hurt by the people I depend on. All of us have been hurt by people we've depended on at some point in our lives, and that can be very painful. It's not fun to be vulnerable. But we can't have good relationships without vulnerability. So what we're aiming for then is to think about what would be a good kind of dependency. I think we talk a lot about bad dependency, so what would good dependency look like? And I think it would look like a kind of mutual reliance, a mutual care, a mutual interest in one another, shared goals and things like that. And so that mutuality is one of the primary characteristics of good dependency. And so as I've already mentioned this point, so I'll move on. Now the thing about our species, the human species, is dependency is existential for us. If you look at it from an evolutionary point of view, all the people that went before that weren't good at dependency, well, they don't have any descendants. They're out of the gene pool. Because human beings live by being social. In our origins, we were hunter-gatherers. We depended on a small group of people. We divided labor. We worked together. We cared for each other's children. Whoever brought in food shared it with everybody. So that's our origin as a species. Now, the same thing is true. When people are lonely or when they're socially excluded, they are vulnerable to serious illness. They are vulnerable to death. The mortality risk of loneliness, chronic loneliness, is as strong as the mortality risk of smoking or obesity or lack of exercise. So just feeling like no one cares about me is really a threat of death if I have that in a chronic way. So it's existential for us. So it's not something we can really do away with, however much we want to try. So it's unavoidable. And let me just list some domains where we're dependent on each other. So for me to know who I am, I have to have you help me know that. I can't know that all by myself. My identity is partly dependent on how you treat me and how you see me. Your identity is partly dependent on how I treat you and how I see you. When we use language, that's something, and we're language creatures, we're linguistic creatures, we can't do that without each other. Language is something we have in common. If we don't, it's not language, right? There's no such thing as a private or individual language. When we think and reason, we do that mostly together. We use the tools and the ideas and the concepts that other people have come up with. Human beings are enormously cooperative. We miss that sometimes, but mostly because we notice people who aren't cooperating with us and they irritate us. We're very vigilant about cooperation. So it's something we have. Every single thing you do in life involves cooperation. Try sometime to think about one single thing you did in a whole day that didn't involve any cooperation at all. I don't think you can do it. We're a group belonging species. And we share a lot of goods. So a lot of the things that are really important to us in life, we can't actually do alone. So I can't have intimacy by myself. I have to have intimacy with someone else. I can't have justice by myself. That's something that is in our relationship. How we relate to each other is either fair or unfair or somewhere in between. So those are things that we can only have together. Democracy is another thing we can only do together. So these are some of the most important things in the world. So, what would excellent dependency look like? Well, what Aristotle said is that's friendship. He called friendship excellent dependency. And that's something, it's like an everyday concept. But the idea, again, is that we want to have excellent friendships, not just any old kind of relationship. So one kind of friendship, or two kinds of friendship, are the ones that are based on outcomes. We're friends because it's fun to be together. Or we're friends because we help each other, we give each other benefits. Nothing wrong with those kind of friendships. Everybody should have some like that. But the problem with them is if it stops being fun, or if we don't get advantages or benefits from that person, then the friendship is over. That's because the point of it was the outcomes, not the friend. The other kind of friendship Aristotle talked about is more communally based. He called it virtue friendship. And now, I forgot to tell you about what philia means. I'll sneak in a little bit of Greek here. Philia is the word that gets translated as friendship in Aristotle's works, but what he meant by that is much bigger than what we usually think of as friendship. So it's not just who my buddy is. He's thinking of all kinds of relationships where people matter to us. Parents and children, spouses, business partners, political allies, all kinds of friendships fit in, or all kinds of relationships fit into philia. So what does a virtue friendship look like? Well, the first thing about a virtue friendship is we notice someone's good qualities. What is good about them? What's worthwhile about them? What do they do that's good in the world? And we notice that and we appreciate it. We value it very much. We have shared activities and goals. Our friendships tend to be built around things that we do together. And if those things are good, positive things, then that puts us in a position to have a virtue friendship. So our friend could be someone who's helping us create a well-being university, what Beth talked about. Our friend could be someone who's helping us with early childhood education, or our friends can be people we're working together with to increase happiness in the world, or to raise children. There's all kinds of good things that we do, and virtue friendships are the relationships that really help us to do that well. So we also tend to have a shared identity. So Beth and I share an identity, we just met today, as educators, as higher education faculty. So, or we could share an identity, people share identities as parents or as carpenters, right? That they're doing something that partly defines them and that they do together. Our friends' welfare is really important to us in virtue friendships. We really care how our good friends fare. That it matters. If they're not doing well, we don't feel like we're doing as well. If they're doing great, it helps us to feel great. And there's actually some really great research that tells you a lot about that. And then finally, in our virtue friendships, we share sorrows and we share joys. There's a great Swedish proverb that says that shared sorrow is halved and shared joy is doubled. And every time I say that, almost everybody nods. Yeah, that's exactly right. That's my experience. So when I can share my sorrows, I don't feel quite as bad. And when I share my joys, it's much more fun. Okay, so that's what we do in virtue friendships as well. The other virtue I won't really go into, but I think it makes immediate sense, is in our good friendships, our excellent friendships, we're loyal to each other. We have each other's backs. We care about it. We protect each other. We stick by each other in tough times. So just so you know that I'm sparing you a whole bunch of other material, I've got some other slides here about vulnerability, diversity, imperfection. If we have more time sometime, I'd love to talk to you about the frailties and the virtues that go along with that, and agency. We get to decide, but deciding is hard, right? So that's that. So let me bring this to a conclusion by saying that human beings can flourish with frailty. That's possible. That is really important that we think about our limitations and our suffering as part of the good life, not as something separate from or an obstacle to the good life. That what we need to do is to function excellently, to be excellent friends, so that we can be excellent in the area of dependency, for example. And so the virtues are the strengths that make that possible, and they're attuned to specific human frailties. So the idea is that we flourish in and through our limitations and weaknesses rather than in spite of them. So let me just close with a little example of that that's related to dependency, and that is that when you love someone, you will lose them. We know this. We don't like to think about it. It's painful to think about it. I could choke up thinking about some of the people that I've lost. Some that I lost, that was okay. But, but there are others that really matter to me, and when I lost them or when you've lost someone you really care about deeply, it's painful. We suffer. And the question I would have for you is, would you want to eliminate that suffering? Would it be better not to have pain at loss? I don't think so. I think that pain we experience is a way of honoring that person, is a way of recognizing how important they are in our lives, and a way of carrying them with us. So even though it hurts, it makes us better, and it allows us to maintain those relationships even in spite of death or divorce or any other kind of separation. So I think that it's possible for us to flourish, that we shouldn't avoid these problems, but that we should embrace our humanity and accept the fact that we can't have everything our own way and be happy all the time no matter how hard we try. Thanks.
So we actually do have a little bit of time because of the way we did the format. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about, you blasted through a whole bunch of really exciting stuff. And one of them had to do with agency and people. How do you decide? How do you decide what to do and where to go? Before I do that, though, one thing that's intriguing to me about what you're doing is you're in counseling psychology. Is that correct? Is that your field?
Yes.
But you spend a lot of time with Aristotle, and I presume with other philosophers like McIntyre, et cetera. I'm really excited by that because my field's technology and business and society and all this, and the last couple of years I've been digging into philosophy to try and figure out what it might tell us about where we might be going and what questions we should be asking ethically as a human experience, et cetera. How do you make that connection? How did that come about maybe in your career that you thought, hey, this philosophy stuff, I can actually apply it in the world with real people? How did that come about?
Well, that's, you know, you ask a professor a question, you usually get a history lesson.
Yeah, that's all right.
So I'll give you a story. The way this happened for me is that early in my career, most of the research I was doing was on marriages and close relationships. And so I would study this, and a lot of people were doing this research. And the way they would approach it typically is what I would call a communication skills satisfaction model. So they would teach that if you have good skills, you can be satisfied with your relationship, things will go well, and you have a good prospect. But when I looked at the skills and thought about them, what I started to realize is, well, that's not really a very good way to think about it. And one little anecdote that helped me with that is my wife and I once went out to dinner with 2 other psychologists, so we had 4 psychologists in the car, and the other 2 psychologists were having an argument, and they were using communication skills brilliantly to put each other down and to win. And so that convinced me that, wait a minute, these things aren't good or bad, they can be used for good or bad ends.
I dated a psychologist years ago, and emphasis on years ago, and she told me one time, Rob, I think you're in denial. And I knew what was coming, so I said, Tricia, I respect your professional opinion, and I've thought really hard about this, and I'm quite sure that's not the case. And she said, that's the first sign of denial. And I said, okay, well, I guess this argument's over.
That's right.
So
right.
This agency thing, how do people decide? Talk a little bit about that and in terms of the context of well-being, happiness, all of these things. How do people decide?
Let's see if I can go back and, no, I can't. Well, the thing about agency is that I think first of all, it's really important. And sometimes in psychology, we talk about things as though there's a cause of everything. And so that people don't really have choices. I'm a firm believer that we have agency. I don't use the term free will that you mentioned before because I don't think it is free. We have to pay for it, both in terms of taking responsibility and in terms of living with consequences, and in terms of dealing with how do we choose in our context. It's not just something, we can't choose any old thing we want to. We have to choose things that are available to us. So one of the things that Aristotle talked about the most is, well, first he talked about friendship more than any other virtue, which is very interesting. The second thing he talked about was practical wisdom. That's probably second on his list of topics in the Nicomachean Ethics. What practical wisdom is being able to look at your circumstances and understand what's really important. So what's important, what's trivial, what's central, what's peripheral. And so the ability to be able to sort that out and figure out, oh, well, this person is unhappy and there's something I might be able to do about that. Or there's an opportunity, so I have 3 opportunities to give speeches this weekend. So I have to figure out which one would be the one that would be the best thing to do. I have to figure out how to arrange something else. So practical wisdom is that ability. And so it's one that we have to cultivate, but really it comes down to understanding what's important. And that's the core of Aristotle's ethics.
And so figuring that out, and it's different for everyone,
right,
relates to living a more effective life.
I would say a richer life.
Yeah, richer life.
Yeah, I'm not a real fan of effective because
I understand
it's a little
it's
instrumental.
laden with certain
means ends kind of
connotations.
thinking, yeah. But by the way, I'm delighted that you're studying the philosophy of technology. I think that's...
I'd love to talk more. I mean, I'm not looking so much at the philosophy of technology a little bit, but also about what is reality, because with virtual reality, we're transitioning into a place where that will become real. The post-virtual world will happen in our lifetimes. Issues like epistemology and how do we know, does that change, the brain, what is the role of the brain, et cetera. So I loved your concept, free will comes at a cost.
Yes.
But it also can be money well spent.
Absolutely.
Thanks a lot, Blaine.
Thank you.
Great.